All right, one other thing. I know we're bumping up against it a little bit, but one other thing I want to talk about before we go into the fun half is this Warren proposal from yesterday. And there's a couple of things happening in the Senate that are very interesting in terms of Democratic potential candidates for the presidency. So Elizabeth Warren yesterday, and I haven't seen the specific details of it, but she will release, or has, I think as of yesterday, released a bill that would effectively create a government-run pharmaceutical manufacturer to mass produce generic drugs and bring down prices in the same process. The bill would establish an Office of Drug Manufacturing that would be required to manufacture at least 15 generic drugs in its first year, where the agency determines there is a failure in the market. The standards for determining a market failure will be threefold. One, if no company is producing a generic drug. People get surprised by this, but this happens all the time. They don't produce a drug because there's not enough money to be made at it. I mean, which in and of itself is a perfect example of, I mean, they call it a market failure. This is not a market failure. This is intrinsic to capitalism. These are the intrinsic limitations to capitalism. The idea that there are no beneficial things in the world that can't, as defined by whether you can profit on it or not, is absurd. It's an absurd premise. We have examples all around us. Did you know that there is a Lyme disease vaccination, Michael?
No.
Coming from an area where there's a tremendous amount of Lyme disease.
Like you
I did
can't
know that.
go hiking
Did
in
you
the
know
woods.
that?
Yeah, I've had it.
You had that?
Sucks. No, Lyme disease.
Okay. The vaccination was rolled out about, I think, 30 some odd years ago. It was only about 70% effective, but 70% effective is pretty good.
Pretty good relative to getting an incredibly damaging disease. Yeah.
And it was just not enough people used it at the time. They took it off the market. Has never been seen. They're probably sitting on the patent.
That's competition would start kicking in.
Right.
And even more, and expanding it out, we know that there's whole sets of tropical and infectious diseases that predominantly hit like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia that there's just not even any broad research into dealing with them because there's no market
money.
for
There's
them.
no money in it.
And we also know in the late 90s, the Clinton administration threatened to slap sanctions on South Africa because they were going to produce generics for their AIDS medications when their crisis was spiking.
Yep. So in this instance, one of the market failures is if no company is producing the drug. If one or two companies are making the drug and there's a shortage or a recent price hike higher than medical inflation, that would also kick in the drug manufacturing bureau, essentially. Or if the drug is on the World Health Organization's essential medicine list and the price is deemed too high while being produced by only one or two companies. So, but the idea of the U.S. government getting into producing a product, I'm trying to think if there's another example of that. This is it's an obvious proposal. We should be doing this. We should be doing this with a bunch of stuff. I think we should be running the oil refineries, frankly. I think we should
100%.
be delivering the internet. But those are all sort of like more like services. In terms of products, frankly, I think we should be in the business of doing this not just for generic drugs. We should be doing this for a whole host of things.
There should just be a pure public pharmaceutical option, even before you go to nationalize all pharmaceuticals, which
there
I would
should be
support.
a use it or lose it patent requirement. The idea that people are sitting on intellectual property that could save lives or improve the lives of people, and they're just sitting on it to prevent a competitor from getting it down the road is absurd.
I think, frankly, there should be a use it or lose it for all patents.
That's
just
probably
the
true.
most important pharmaceutical ones, but intellectual property in terms of creative culture as well.
But she has pointed to that story about the 300 generic drugs and 16 companies that were price fixing. as a sign that her policy is needed. But just like even in the short moment that we contemplate, because one of the things that we have in this country is a failure to imagine like how government could continue to make our lives better. How could policies that are meant to that are not considered market or capitalist policies can improve our lives, and stuff like this starts to jog the imagination a little bit. Now, the interesting thing about this, now, of course, it's not going to, we're not going to pass this in the Senate. I don't know how many even Democratic senators will sign on to it. We'll see. Last week, Merkley, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar introduced the Cure High Drug Prices Act, which allows federal government to block price increases on certain drugs. That, in my mind, does not go far enough, but I like it. Again, Merkley put forward separate legislation, the Low Drug Prices Act. A week earlier, Bernie Sanders introduced his own bill, the Prescription Drug Price Relief Act, in November. You see a lot of activity. All of those people could very well run for the presidency. However, and maybe we'll do that bet thing later. We're going to pre-record something with Perrine for next week, but I think, particularly coming after that meeting that Warren and Sanders had last week, this is a sign to me that Sanders may not be running. Because if I'm Elizabeth Warren and I'm running and I know that Sanders is running, now maybe he hasn't decided yet, which is quite possible. But
who knows?
This is a very risky thing for her to do because this is a pretty radical piece of legislation. I mean, I think she's very good at presenting things that are radical in the context of the United States, where we're at politically, but just making them sound a little bit more sort of like obvious and homespun on some level. But this is a pretty, she's leaning into it quite a bit. And if she's going to be running against Bernie Sanders, the lane she's going to choose is not going to be to the left of Bernie Sanders. The lane she's going to choose is going to be just to the right of Bernie Sanders. And this policy puts her to the left of Bernie Sanders.
Or maybe she's trying to appropriate some of his politics to win.
I think he does that if Sanders is not there. I mean, look, you pick a lane in a primary. And it's quite possible that that lane on the left of her is opened up. That's exactly my point, is that she's not going to try and out Bernie Sanders because no Bernie Sanders supporters are going to abandon him for her because she's got more left policies. They're going to abandon him for her because they think that she can win. Her policies are good enough or whatever it is. And so her lane is not to the left of Bernie Sanders unless Bernie Sanders is not going to be there, in which case then she needs to bring those people in. This is just my theory.
It also could be possible that she's savvy enough to recognize that the dynamics are shifting so much that she needs to, in the context even of this primary, to be slightly to the right of him, but theoretically more palatable, although the polling doesn't show that. She needs to reach a little bit deeper into her left flank. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep. It's possible. I guess time will tell.
And it ices out the other people trying to do that,
and
too.
It totally ices out, right? Because like a guy like Sherrod Brown at this point, who I think is another good candidate, but he's fully playing that lane, which is like, I have a more serious, legislative, and credible progressive labor record. I'll stack that against anybody. And he's very clearly like, I'm not going to call for abolishing ICE. I'm not going to do Medicare for all yet, because he's totally going the lane of like, I'm a legislator, I'm serious, right. I'm going to run in the Midwest, blah, blah, blah. And so Elizabeth Warren is actually going to triangulate between those two positions, and I think she needs to shore up her flank on her left.
We'll see. Merkley and Sherrod Brown also introduced legislation that would permanently ban members of Congress and senior staff from trading individual stocks. The idea that you can even do that now is just absurd. Well, what we've seen, but it's interesting. This is the thing, there's a little bit of like a racehorsey stuff to the quality of this, but the other part that's really great about it is introducing this legislation is a sense of where, gives you a sense of where these candidates are going to run, and it gives you a sense of just like what's happening in the Democratic Party is very encouraging, because there is a certain clamoring, even if people want to be rooted in the like. I mean, none of these people we're talking about seem to want to be rooted in the center of the Democratic Party, but to the extent that they want to be anchored a certain distance away from that center, they're still the drift, the current is to the left. And so, everybody, they may drop their anchor, but if you look at the direction in which the chain that is attached to their boat is, it's all tracking to the left.
100%.
Yeah, and that's encouraging, but I still want to make the distinction between rhetoric and policy, right? Because we've heard
Well, these are policy
a
proposals.
lot.
These are
Yeah,
policy proposals.
but are they actually going to prioritize those things once they're in office? And I think you need to look at
depending on
someone's
the
past record
I
for
agree.
evidence of that.
I agree with that 100%.
and
right?
who gives them money.
But the other big question, and how mobilized and aggressive their base is, and what they need to satisfy in the context of holding on
Right.
power.
The idea is that the more people glam on to, and by people I mean like actual people, attach themselves to these policies, the more weight they have to give them. Like if you see a policy that that a candidate has and you like that policy, start to organize around it and create and make it something that they can't let go of. That's the idea.
Now, I don't know. This article doesn't seem that revelatory, and I don't know how well connected, but Jonathan Martin in the New York Times, his report on this meeting is Sanders and Warren meet and agree that they're both probably running.
Yeah.
So, but that doesn't, I'm reading into it, and all it conveys is like they're friendly and they respect each other and they're talking, which could just as easily mean what Sam's saying it means.
Who knows?
Or it could mean like, hey, we're both going to run, but let's try to not tear each other apart because we're in a similar lane. Or it could mean that she's saying, I'm not going to run and I want more specific wonky things from you.
Right.
This is what I thought was going to happen. And I'm so annoyed that we have to talk about the presidential race in 2020 already. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking policy.
No, I know. It's just very triggering for me. I talk about it too, though. It's fine. I get really invested in it. I'm not ready.
Yeah, everything will be fine.
I'm looking forward to Cory Booker proposing like summary executions for Sheldon Adelson or something. He's like super on it. Cory Booker's like, I think all oligarchs actually need to be put to death. That's the most spiritually sound strategy.